So can you just tell us who you are and like how you self-identify and like where you're based, that sort of thing?
Sure. My name is Don Hanson. As an artist, I go by the name Don XYZ, and I'm an internet artist, primarily making new media works that are connected to the World Wide Web. I run a virtual gallery and DIY online art space called New Art City. The website is newart.city. And I'm currently based in New York City, and I moved recently from the Bay Area where I lived for 14 years.
Thank you. So what is your earliest memory that you have of working with art and or technology?
I was exposed to a lot of like educational video games really early on. We had a computer in the house ever since I can remember. And so I spent a lot of time in virtual spaces and doing playing with user interfaces like from a very young age. And when I grew up, at least, and started doing design as like a visual and graphic designer, um, I found joy in producing interactive experiments similar to game design. Um, and I always wanted to create interactivity using code. And my path kind of transitioned from just being a designer that creates images into somebody who can create interactivity and explore ideas using code. And that was kind of my early experience, like when I was graduating college, creating interactive prototypes and internet art experiments. But at that time, I didn't really know it was internet art. I didn't know internet art existed or was a thing. I was just doing experiments online. And when I became exposed to contemporary art and learned about new media art and internet art, I realized that that's what I had been doing and moving towards the entire time. And so I kind of refocused my branding and portfolio and energy towards engaging with contemporary art and working as an internet artist and connecting with the global internet art community. Does that work?
It's perfect. It's beautiful. Yeah, perfect. Um, so I'm going to ask an interstitial question that wasn't on the list, but
Mhm.
I think um, you kind of identified. So one of the projects that you, well, let's just be, fully transparent. Like you came to San Jose State, as a part of that trajectory, right? To get an MFA. And one of the projects that we had talked about in the early days of your tenure there was a kind of visualization of that kind of history of internet art. Can you kind of talk about your conceptualization of that project, and then maybe we can use that as a way to kind of talk about how you found your way to New Art City itself. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. Um, so when I first started engaging with internet art and new media art, I didn't have all of the information that I needed. And I started a research project called Found You Online, which is a website that's a database for new media art. And in the process of making this database, I was able to gather enough information about like what is actually happening in new media art, what's historically important, who's active right now. Um, but this is like new media art is a niche, but I wanted to go deeper into a sub niche of internet art because there's that information is also kind of hard to find. Like there's kind of only one major database, and that's the Rhizome art base, but it's not as user friendly as I wanted that information to be. So I was initially thinking to create an internet art database that is more for what's currently happening in contemporary new media or contemporary internet art, because there isn't really a place for internet artists to gather and to share their work. Like the kind of like basic idea was like to make something that's akin to SoundCloud for music, but where people post their newly created internet artworks for others to see and comment on. And that project never really came together because while it was in the planning phases, the pandemic started and New Art City became my focus. It kind of came out of this like rapid immediate need to have an online exhibition space, which is somewhat related to a place for internet artists to post their work, but it wasn't so specific to URL based artworks. It was more for all artworks that could be digitized or digital artworks.
So do you want to talk a little bit about the kind of early conceptualization? You kind of gave us an orientation. So what did the deployment look like? And yeah, can you set up kind of a framework for us there?
Yeah. Prior to starting work on New Art City, I had been experimenting with 3D in the browser for a couple years, just kind of making like visual experiments and trying to learn how 3JS works. And 3JS is this software framework that's open source that is the most popular rendering engine for 3D on the web. There's a lot of other frameworks that are built upon it, like A-Frame, for example. And so my experiments with 3JS kind of gave me like a very, very basic understanding of how to render 3D in the browser. And when it came time to like make a prototype for a virtual art gallery, I just followed some really basic examples on the 3JS website, like a first-person controller. And I kind of made my own script for randomly distributing artworks within this space. And as soon as you could like have a first-person view in a 3D space and have artworks that were uploaded into it, that was a really exciting experience, especially because the other options for doing that at the time were pretty limited or non-existent or not customizable. So being able to create something that felt personalized and fast and easy was a great motivator because people were excited about it.
And so that kind of developed out of a very specific need and really quickly, right? Because you had already been iterated on this idea, there's a few features that have developed since the initial kind of conception. Do you want to talk a little bit about the evolution of New Art City since that kind of pandemic lockdown experience?
Yeah. So the New Art City project started out as just a way to view artworks in a 3D space. And then the first major priority after that prototype was to include multiplayer features, because personally the most exciting part of an art exhibition is actually attending it and seeing other people and having a social experience, discussing the art. And I wanted to make sure that people felt like these virtual events were actually events and not just a website that you can go to anonymously and without any interaction with other people. So in order to get that first step, I brought on Benny and Martin as like the first two collaborators, and it was just the three of us, three developers working for a long time, like pretty much trying to work as fast as we possibly could. It was really an unsustainable pace, but there was a lot of excitement around the project, and we wanted to build as fast as possible and create something, especially because people were using it. And after multiplayer, we started building a content management system on top of the 3D space. And this was allowing people to upload artworks. And as soon as you could upload artworks, we started seeing all sorts of random weird files that I couldn't render in the 3D space. So we started implementing all the different file types that could be uploaded, such as images, videos, audio files, multi-channel synchronization of videos, 3D models, of course. And 3D models form the basis for like architecture and like the placeness of virtual spaces. And after a while, we implemented live streams so people could give artist talks or presentations or performances in the 3D space. And that contributes, again, more to the feeling of being there and having an event that's only happening at a certain time. A huge part of this project is really just making an intuitive user interface for developing 3D spaces. Because developing a 3D space, if you're writing the code for that, it could take weeks or months, but we wanted to bring that down to like days or hours or minutes. Do something that is helpful for artists and people who don't know how to code or don't want to know how to code, and just create a really easy user interface for making these 3D spaces.
Beautiful answer. Yeah, really exciting. I love also thinking about your priority as being, just get it done and, make it as easy as possible for artists to get work uploaded, right? And part of that was probably just how do we create a space for folks who have lost spaces during COVID? But I think also, just as a kind of a startup kind of culture, that there's that kind of, yeah, impetus and drive to get something built. And the fact that is kind of browser based and the architecture is what it is, like you had access to the error messages, and so allowing the error like the bugs to kind of like guide the development process, I think is really interesting, because in many ways anybody uploading exhibitions at that time were your beta testers, right? Like that was, and one of the things that you were really generous about was working with us at San Jose State, which I might talk about in a second. But maybe we can talk about like other platforms that you might have been looking at, or because you had been kind of working through a history of new media art, were there other like historical platforms or other platforms that existed contemporary, like at the same time, that you were looking at and guiding, some of your design decisions?
I guess maybe no. Like there are some 3D virtual gallery builder tools that existed when we started. I don't really want to name who they are because I don't think they were very good. I don't want to name names about that.
Or maybe
But
you could like, yeah, talk about general features rather than specific platforms. Yeah.
I guess the sort of like design like category of what New Art City is actually just a website builder. And there's like plenty of other tools in this space. Like there's been what you see is what you get editors out there for a very long time. And having worked as a web designer and a web developer, I've been working in these tools since the beginning of my career and have been like building websites and content management systems and tools for generating web pages for a long time. And the major shift here is just that instead of building a 2D web page, this is outputting a 3D web page.
I actually think that's really interesting. Like that framing of this is not necessarily like a world building toolkit, but that it's a website. I think that distinction is really fascinating to think about. And yeah, I think it guides a lot of the decisions, like now kind of thinking about, especially some of the UI and backend. I think that as a principle makes a ton of sense, thinking about it.
Yeah, like if we put ourselves in the category of like Squarespace and Tumblr and WordPress and Wix and all of these site builder tools that offer some sort of flavor of like a website that comes out. New Art City is a type of website builder, but as a 3D website, which
Yeah.
is a big step, I guess, in content management system design.
Yeah. Yeah. But it also leaves, the blank canvas rather than getting too fussy in the kind of 3D canvas space itself, right? Like you let the users have a lot of control over that. And then maybe part of that's the workflow using other 3D, building tools because they have that, like, not reinventing the wheel so much as like creating a layer on top of it that can extend and enhance. It's really, yeah, a really
Right.
fascinating way to think about it. So maybe this distinction is, so there's like two ways to think about my next question. It was kind of written to think about the differences between like a in-person exhibit, right? This was kind of developed as in many ways to fulfill a need for the lack of the in-person exhibition, but also has kind of created a world unto its own. So like post-pandemic lockdown, right? Starting to, you're continuing to build and continuing to expand. So what do you think, some of these benefits of, this kind of format could be? And you can think about that lots of different ways, the benefits of both like Web 3D, but also the benefits of some of the toolkits and the discoverability features that you've implemented on top of that as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the reason to build and use a virtual space has morphed a lot over the past 3 years. The initial reason was, of course, because we couldn't have any physical exhibitions. And so everybody, regardless of if you work in virtual or online or physical or a museum, everybody had to do online exhibitions. There was no choice. So that was a huge driver for innovation very quickly, and it gave us exposure and feedback to all of these different points of view within the art world of what people need and what they want. And by integrating their feedback and learning what all of these different user types needed, we built out a tool that was pretty flexible for both like individuals and organizations and educators and all of these different user types. And as the world outside of the virtual space has changed, the organizations that have typically and historically ran in-person exhibitions were very eager to get back to their in-person exhibitions because that's what they're good at, and they have an audience and they have a space. So those organizations have been working less in the virtual space now that they're able to do physical exhibitions, but we still see some physical organizations using virtual space to reach a wider audience and to explore concepts and ideas that they couldn't do in person, as well as work with artists who are situated in different parts of the world. And so the growth of the toolkit has also attracted artists who are more interested in working in non-physical environments. And this benefits both artists who are making digital media that doesn't show very well in a physical gallery, and it shows very well in a virtual space, and also artists who just want to experiment with virtual space and create like completely unrealistic environments and like even like small games or interactive spaces. And it's kind of unlocked this sort of new medium. And we're seeing a lot of interest from these individual artists who want to experiment with this new space.
Awesome. And I'm going to switch some questions around a little bit right now, just because I think it dovetails nicely on what you were just talking about. Is there an exhibit that on New York City that like stands out to you? And are there kind of features in that exhibit that exemplify some of the things that you were just talking about, these kind of new concepts or new ways of working that have become unlocked because of the platform?
This one is really hard to answer because
I know.
there's so many exhibitions. But
You could also like approach it as like a piecemeal, right? Like bits of and pieces too.
yeah, um, the ones that I like to use in examples as examples and share are the ones where the artists really used all of the features in the way that they were intended to be used and did a really great job with the both the quality of the work and like the um, focus of the idea that they're presenting. Because New Art City is web-based, there's a limit to how much content you can put on one space because it's bandwidth and it's load times. And my favorite spaces are focused on one idea that's executed in a very, I guess, masterful way that shows their artistry, that shows their aesthetics, and it shows usually some sort of like concept that goes with the work. Tangible Data by Baron Lantaine was probably the first exhibition that was created start to finish by an individual without any help from the New Art City team. And we were really impressed. And this is a really great example of something that like somewhat resembles a physical space, but also kind of breaks the laws of reality a little bit with like floating sculptures and images that are like draped over objects. Another one that I really like to share with people is called Eat Me. Let me get to it.
Is this the former MFA student at Berkeley?
I don't know if she was a former MFA student. Um, so the show Eat Me by Alice Yuan Zhang is a really excellent example of a conceptual space in New Art City that takes you on a journey, and it's um, a simulation of being digested where the stomach is consuming media from the internet.
Love, love it. Yeah, I mean, every time and one of my favorite assignments to give, and this is like, outside of the interview. So if anybody transcribing this, cut this part out. But one of my favorite things to do with students is assign them like just like go out into the wild in New Art City and like come back with like what are the exhibitions that you like, what are successful, and like I'm constantly
Yeah,
asking them to do something that I started initially out of the internship class, which is like a feature-based analysis, like what are the features of New Art City that supports this particular artwork, and then also like what are the features of the artwork that are particularly well suited to an exhibition on New Art City. And I think that's evolved a lot, like the ways that we've started to think about um, exhibitions, not just as like a replication of the gallery, but like that something else has become unlocked as well. Like
yeah,
even some of the ones that are like harder to necessarily navigate to remember where you are, but are like, you know, where you've allowed folks to fly through that kind of 360 exploration is also such an interesting, for certain pieces, I think such an interesting way, like to deploy the artwork, where it's
yeah,
non-linear. It doesn't actually matter where you are because the entire thing is about the experience of exploring and kind of being lost and finding, right? And I think that is something that exhibitions, physical exhibitions, because of the limited space, or like even if there are larger institutions, they want things to be more navigatable. And I think that that kind of loss of ground is such an exciting and something that I hadn't really kind of thought about necessarily. Because even in gameplay, I think, there's very few examples, maybe flow, but where like loss of ground is really kind of expertly deployed.
Yeah.
Um, okay,
One
so that
thing,
was a little, yeah, go ahead.
I
Start
just want to,
again.
no, I
Start
just
again
want to
before I'm
mention,
saying something. Yeah.
um, to that point, also not for the interview, but like water levels in video games where you're like swimming, like those are like usually the most hated levels because it's like hard to control. But it's like there, it's almost like a water level when you're flying through a virtual New York City space, but it's like not frustrating because you're not trying to avoid enemies or anything.
Right. Well, I mean, like once you give yourself over to it, right?
Yeah,
And if I'm not like, in those spaces where it's you generally like a little bit more cacophonous and again, things are kind of oriented so that it doesn't really matter which way you're facing. I think the more just successful, the ones where I'm like, I truly lose like the executable function, in my brain where I'm like, okay, now I'm just awash in this space.
yeah,
Yeah, it's really interesting to think about like, yeah, that it's not necessarily an object obstacle environment where, yeah, there's something else that's kind of
yeah.
unfolding and happening.
Um,
Okay,
uh, I want to point to one other space that
cool.
is related to that. Um, One other space that I really love is called Crypto Roots. And this show was curated by Albert Baruch Duran, part of Sonar Plus D, which is a experimental music festival in Barcelona. But this is a really excellent example of a group show in New York City that also rejects physical reality and lets you fly through the space where every piece in this group show is at the end of a root extending from a giant tree in the center. And the space is awesome because uses it uses the environment in a really effective way because you're flying. There's even like little birds flying nearby, and it uses the fog in New York City to always show you just at the end of your vision. There's something else that you can go to encourage exploration.
And like using a functional component of the platform, the fog, as like like a navigation feature almost, or
Yeah,
yeah, an indicator. That's really cool.
right. Yeah, my favorite
I don't think I've seen
projects.
that.
Yeah, my favorite projects use the limitations as a feature rather than fight against them.
It's a beautiful soundbite. I'm just gonna name it.
All right,
So it's now in the transcript. Anybody coming back to do edit work, use that. All
pull
right, so
quote.
yeah, pull quote. All right, so I think maybe time for one-ish more questions. So one of the things that's going to be hard to avoid, moving forward, right, just because of the kind of commonality of the phrase the metaverse right now and the kind of popularization by Mark Zuckerberg and other kind of social media platforms. Um, Web 3D has been around for a long time. The concept of the metaverse has been around for a long time. What are the conversations like? How do you position yourself next to that term, and how do you see it kind of being deployed? And are you interested in some of the conversations developing out and around from the current usage of the term metaverse?
Yeah, this is a really tricky question. Um, so as the metaverse idea gained popularity as a marketing term early last year, there's a lot of misinformation and misunderstanding about what it is. Um, there's a lot of people with a basic understanding of just a video game space or a virtual space as being equal to a metaverse, where there's actually a long history of um, research and ideas about what a true metaverse of connected virtual spaces could be. And I believe that eventually there will be some open source connective libraries for virtual spaces to have this sort of federated ecosystem where they can all connect to each other and certain elements can move between spaces fluidly. But we're kind of a long way away from that. And that idea of a true interconnected metaverse is not how most people understand the term. So at New Art City, we don't use the term metaverse to describe what we're doing because it's not even close to being interconnected to other virtual spaces. And as soon as that's possible, and as soon as we have tools to connect to other spaces and other platforms and other ecosystems, that will be a really interesting thing to try. But because the term metaverse is so confusing for people, and there's a lot of sentiment that equates metaverse with crypto, which also has its own very controversial views. We don't use the term metaverse with New Art City unless we're having this sort of conversation.
I think that's a really interesting and useful definition and kind of declaration, actually. And one of the things, because my last interview was with a developer who was working in 3D web environments in the 90s. And I think I told you, like the team was prescribed before they even like came on board, to read Snow Crash. And like they actually were thinking about, they use fiction, where the term metaverse was coined, right, was in literature, and using fiction as a way to conceive of an environment that was not yet built. And one of the things that kind of came up in the discussions with the developer was like that was a useful framing mechanism, but the way that the developer was thinking was very much in terms of like what are the possibilities of kind of a tech platform right now. In order to do this, what would we need to do? And so the kind of time scale, like it was a useful tool, that expansive thinking, but their time scale, when I asked them, what at the time, what were you imagining the metaverse would look like today? It's like, I was a developer. I was thinking, like 3-month cycles, or, it's very differently. But at the same time, I had kind of in the start of the conversation acknowledged the usefulness of kind of speculative or more artistic based, thinking. As somebody, as an artist, right? So you found your way, towards the development of this platform. What are the way, like, how do you kind of use as an artist, but also as an engineer, and now as somebody, as a founder, like how do you see these skills kind of circulating and kind of interacting with one another as you're thinking about New York City's future?
The future and development plans for New Art City are always guided by what we, I guess, call our mission and our like reasons for doing it in the first place, which is to create better tools for digital artists, solve problems for digital artists, and create a space that's accessible to everybody, both for creators and for visitors who have maybe never even went into a virtual space before. And so I tried to be aware of literature around virtual spaces and prior art and other platforms, but I don't actually look too closely at them for how we define our roadmap, because everybody has different goals. Every project has different goals, and we shouldn't be trying to mimic or keep up with other projects or like create something that somebody else dreamed up, because that's not related to our goals. And so the development, when we're thinking about what to build next, it's always like, how do we make it easier for people? How do we support artists? And how do we make it more fun?
Beautiful. Another wonderful soundbite there. Thank you, Don.
Thanks.
So I want to give you your time back. I know, we got started a little bit late, but this has been so fun. Like I think, since I've been a part of this like so closely, haven't really pulled back and asked some of these questions with you. So it's actually really
Mhm.
informative and really fun for me to listen to your answers, which is a really good sign. I think it means that our readers will also be really interested too.
Cool.
Yay. Thank you,
Yeah.
Don, so
Yeah.
much.
Thank you so much.
And I'll send out the edited version of both the video and the text for you to take a look at. Let me know what you
Okay.
think. Cool.
Cool. Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.